Hi, everybody. Welcome to another version of the Bruce Singer podcast. We have another great podcast for you, and I'm going to share you a bit about the podcast. And I'm Bruce, and I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm also the founder and CEO of Canada CFOs, which produces the podcast and is also provides fractional CFOs to the same space, which is food, beverage, ag tech, and right across the entire food ecosystem, food tech. And we do this podcast, and it's really good to bring some value to our audience and our clientele and our potential clientele. That's how we do it, our community. I have a very exciting guest on today, Sara Hipson. And I'm going to tell you about Sara. Well, Sara, welcome to the podcast. Pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Sara is the director of grants at Asgard Consulting. She has a little over 10 years of experience as an expert in the area of government funding and economic development, which she'll share more with you. She's really very insightful. And she's also really very much an impact-driven person, sits on charity boards, involved in non-for-profits, very, very impactful driven, which I think is awesome. And I think that's great. Really cares about causes and charities and things like that. And she's also an avid forest conservationist. And yesterday, this podcast had been delayed, by the way, but yesterday with Earth Day, we were talking about that before the podcast and her initiatives in that space, and which is really awesome, which is so important. So today's very exciting. We're going to talk about a very important topic, a lot of learning to be involved, which is the area of government funding, government grants, economic development, which is I'm a topic that I'm very, very fond of, and I like to learn more. So welcome aboard, and we're going to get right into it. So Sara, tell us, what is Asgard Consulting? What's the story?
Yeah. So thanks for the introduction, by the way, and thanks for having me on this.
Awesome.
I just really appreciate it. I love what you're doing here, and excited to connect with your sort of network of food folks. And so to give you a real quick Asgard, so I worked in government funding for about the last 10 years. It's amazing when you start to look back at kind of the path that has charted you to where you are today. And for me, I'm rolling up on a decade now working in different government funding and economic development space. And so in the last year, I've had some transition and decided to, work through the idea of starting my own grant advisory practice, and started working with some colleagues out in Calgary through Asgard Consulting. And so joined their, I don't like the word boutique, but we'll call it a boutique because it is quite sort of nimble still. Yep. Management consulting firm that essentially our goal is to support Canadian SMEs access creative funding solutions to support their growth. And so, prior to me joining, this was, how do we secure different lending solutions or debt and equity for partners and clients as they're sort of moving through their business journey. And I was approached by a partner, and it was suggested that I start a grants practice as well. And so that's kind of where we are. Fast forward, we're several months in now, and just ticking away, trying to keep up and keep on top of all the different funding options that are available to our clients.
Awesome. And by the way, I just want to share with the audience, we're getting into a discussion because we're going to talk about the food and ag space. That is coming. You do a lot more than that, but we're going to make sure when we talk about the content side, we're going to focus on the food and ag. Otherwise, we'd have one very long podcast.
Yeah.
We'll do that today. Because this theory is short attention span. Okay.
And just for the record, too, I guess on that same note, I've worked with a number of different businesses over the years, but definitely the food and beverage sector has been a major priority for us based on the supports that are available through the government, as well as, obviously food is near and dear to everybody and important. And so obviously this is a sector that has funding and should have funding. And we expect to continue to see that trend from the government.
Thank you so much. So let's step aside now. And I'd like to hear a bit of your story. Because, again, by the way, we had a little chat before the podcast. And 20 years ago, did you think you'd be your own business director? That's not the case. Never. So
no. Yeah. Great question. So how did I get here?
How'd you get it? Let's take a step back. Let's go back. How far you want to go back? You go back to childhood if you want, teenager, whatever you like. And how'd you get to this point in time?
Oh, reminiscing. Thank you for letting me go back and sort of reflect. It's been a while since I've sort of checked in on that. So, I'll start. Childhood, definitely was a daughter of a small business owner father. So my father was an entrepreneur. His business failed, and not to his own fault, just sort of based on the climate conditions, the economic conditions at the time. And he was outpaced by global multinational competitors, and he just kind of got squeezed out of the market. So from a young age, I sort of saw how, the impact of businesses failing, what that impact is on families. And so for me today, that's kind of, sort of skipping some of the middle parts, but important, I think, to note. My motivation today for supporting businesses to access funding is really around helping them to professionalize and identify different sources of whether it's funding or resourcing that will help them to be successful and avoid, not being able to pay the mortgages that they serve, being their employees, right? Those are families that they're supporting. So that's really my why at the end of the day. But to get there, so I definitely didn't think I was going to be a government funding advisor. I studied environmental sciences and forest conservation in post-secondary and moved out to BC actually to work in industrial forest industry. And so spent several years out in BC and early on was kind of identified as somebody who would be a good fit for economic development and sort of community development initiatives, and started working at a regional economic development trust that was a funding agency, as well as a sort of economic development change maker for Northern BC. So I worked there for a number of years, building programs, identifying, support systems and resourcing for businesses in our ecosystem and in our region, and providing them with, whether it be grants or incentives to engage with a consultant to build a health and safety system or something like that, so that they can have a better and more sophisticated business model to help them grow. So that's kind of where I started in funding. And then from there, moved back to Ontario. For those of you at West, I like to make the joke of Ontario, but, don't hold that against me. For those of you here, usually gets a chuckle. And then I started working at another government funding organization, which I didn't even know existed, by the way. So essentially worked at a company called MentorWorks for a number of years and, really learned about how funding works, what the landscape looks like in Canada, and how businesses can and should access those resources. The last, I would say, I spent 5 years at MentorWorks doing this for different clients. And some of you may know me from there. We do a lot of webinars, a lot of events, lots of things.
You're well known. Yep.
And, at this point, with Asgard and kind of our path forward, the idea is how do we support maybe on a smaller scale, but on an impactful scale, businesses. And, I do have a particular interest in, and we'll say hankering, no pun intended, for food businesses and supporting them to grow. So that's kind of where we're at now, and trying to build out a book and be thought leaders in the space.
Awesome. Okay, so I got a few questions I want to talk about, because everybody needs money. I mean, especially what they perceive as free money.
Sure.
Needs it. So walk understand the audience. Who gets funding? We're talking about food and agriculture, beverage, that whole space. Who's a fit for funding? Who qualifies for funding? Can you shed some light on? Because I don't know if I might know, but I might not know. I might think I might not make assume I'm not for funding, and maybe I am for funding, and I don't go for funding. Right?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the government funding space, right? And so, I just do my part to kind of educate and sort of knowledge share on what I learned through the process. And I think that's kind of what you're looking for here. So, ultimately what we're looking at, it really comes down to a couple things. So the first is who is applying.
Yep.
The second would be sort of what are you doing and how is it a fit for what the government's putting, dollars out into the ether for. And then are you competitive, right? Versus qualified. So when it comes to the funding that we're talking about here, for the most part, it is proactive. We're building a business case to support it. And, we're going into a competitive intake for funding. It's not everybody gets it. It's not entitlement based like some of the ITCs or investment tax credits that are available to different industries and different activities. And so I think you really we got to start with, who are you? And I guess let's break it down into food. We can dig in for a second here. So when we talk about funding, we break sort of the agri-food funding into two buckets, one being producers. And so your producers are your farmers and your more primary agriculture companies who are actually, growing commodities and bringing them to the market, to the value-added market as a commodity. The second category is your processors or your manufacturers. So, are you in the manufacturing space or are you in the food production space? So it's kind of the initial personas that are important to note. Both of them have funding options available to them depending on where you are and what you're doing. I would say most of the experience that I have working and the success that I've had working is on the processing side with the manufacturers that are taking those primary inputs, those agricultural inputs, and then creating a value-added product. So that goes into sort of retail or whatever the mechanism is. So that's kind of a starting point. The other pieces to keep in mind are kind of like, what are the types of funding that you're looking for? So what are the different projects and activities that you're doing? So regardless of your persona necessarily, what is it that you're trying to achieve? So buckets of funding exist sort of agnostically across industries. And I would say there's definitely niche funding for particular industries that come and go. You might be familiar with the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Program that has been rolled out, I believe it was last year or the year before. Now we're starting to see those funding windows start to actually open. They offer both producer and processor streams of funding. But when it comes to sort of the types and buckets of funding that are available, I like to break those down into five buckets for the sake of this. The first one are your hiring and training incentives. So are you hiring co-ops? Are you bringing on interns from post-secondary? Are you bringing in a subject matter expert, maybe a senior food scientist, and you're working on a natural food product? There could be funding to support those strategic hires. The second piece is, are you working on any third-party training? Are you bringing somebody in to teach your team on a particular skill set to upskill them and support them from a career advancement perspective? There's also grants for that. And that's sort of across Canada and the different provinces that's offered. You may or may not be familiar. And then there's other pieces, right? So there could be a specific training program that's offered or a workforce development program that's offered in food and agriculture. For example, we see the YESP program that comes every year, the Youth Employment Services program. And that program supports 50% up to $14,000 to bring on a youth to work in an agri-food business, and sort of that offsets your wages and your labor costs. So just examples of certain things that make sense. The second bucket is your R&D bucket. So we've got a number of different potential programs that could fall into that for food. You've got your Canada Food Innovation Network, or CFIN, that's out there right now. They've got 3 different programs, I believe, that they offer to food tech and food innovation companies. We've also got your sort of typical ones that, I'm not going to lean into too hard, but your IRAP, your SHRED, and, some of the other ones through the federal AAFC funding through Agri-Innovate, for example, or Agri-Science, where we're working on really novel and game-changing R&D projects at the federal level or sort of collaboratively with different partners. The third bucket is your capital investment. So CAP, for example, the SCAP program. That program offers, funding for different capital improvements that support labor productivity in particular. So, for example, we see pretty regularly between 25 to 35 or even up to 50% funding for agri-food processors who are investing in new productivity equipment that's being implemented into your shop floor, your production environment. And that was the Agri-Tech Innovation Program that just closed recently, actually, at the end of March. Anyway, that program was about $100,000 to support those kind of capital improvements. And then finally, there's this business development, business expansion, and market development category, which I think is also really important to note. So right now we've got things like Can Export that supports new market entry for businesses, including food businesses. And then in Ontario in particular, there's things through SCAP like the Grow Ontario Marketing Initiative or different programs that allow you to access expertise and build your product lines into new export markets, whether that be provincially or sort of outside of Canada. So lots of different things. So that's the 4. And then the last one, everything's sustainability, right? And so the reason why I waver between 4 and 5 buckets is that sustainability is now we're starting to see those through every single other bucket as being an overlying theme, as something that you need to consider. So that's one of the other buckets, I would say.
I have a question I want to ask you, because I'm a numbers guy.
Yeah.
I look at numbers. We get back to your first point, who's a good fit. I'm going to assume it's not as simple. Hey, if I'm doing $1 million a year, or it doesn't work like that. Like to qualify, like you got to be at a certain level. It depends. It's mix and match. It doesn't really work like that because there's a lot of mystique behind everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It can be a bit of there's a word I'm looking for and I can't remember, to clear the maze. You know?
Sure. Yeah.
Because if I'm trying to self-navigate, it's not that simple. You know?
Yeah, like it's doable. And I know a lot of companies have success navigating the space, but what I commonly hear when I am sort of approached or asked to talk about funding or help strategize is that it's really difficult to find what opportunities are available because the timelines come and go, right? And so that's one of the biggest pieces is knowing what funding is available to a particular client and based on what they're trying to do. And then the second piece is then being able to sort of port that information that they're doing and make it make sense into that particular application because every program has different eligibility and qualifying metrics. Right?
But I could be eligible if I'm $1 million company. I could be eligible if I'm a $20 million company.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Yeah.
Eligible if I'm a 30 million. Like there's no boxes.
There is a box, and I would say
is there a box? Yeah.
There's a big box. We'll call it a big box, and then sort of smaller boxes within. But the big box generally, if we're talking about SMEs or small, medium-sized enterprises in Canada, that's what most of this funding is geared towards, almost exclusively.
Okay.
So we're looking at typically companies with less than 500 employees on payroll in Canada. And generally, this is not a hard and fast rule, but under 100 million in some cases. For CFIN, for example, under 50 million. So it's really, they're focusing on those earlier stage companies that are developing tech. But generally speaking, it's those SMEs that fit into there. And then I would also say on the smaller end, and again, this is not mutually exclusive because there is sort of funding across the spectrum. But in terms of bang for your buck and kind of the focus that I have, startups are difficult for funding, right? So that's where things like Shred or other types of innovation acceleration programs make a lot of sense.
Okay.
But sort of if you've got fewer than maybe 10 employees on payroll and you're doing less than $500,000 in revenue annually, then you start to get into that early stage company kind of bracket, and the funding starts to get smaller and it starts to get less common. And so it's really a matter of, it's not necessarily always even that's an eligibility criteria, but it's more of a screening criteria, right? Because if you think about it from an evaluation perspective, what are the key impacts that the government's trying to drive through whatever program it is? And if you're a small impact company, just because you're still quite small and you don't make waves in the larger ecosystem yet, unless you're doing something incredibly innovative and potentially with a sustainability lens, a lot of the bigger funding opportunities are not going to be as easy to secure.
So let me ask you another question. Okay, thank you. Let me ask you another question. And I don't know if this is as simple to answer. In terms of who gets the wins, the most common is a $500,000, 200,000. Is there certain, or it's all over the map? Is it all over the place? Or have you seen, hey, the most common when it comes to food and ag, on average, it's if they qualify, if they win, usually the averages are between 50 to 250,000. Is there can you make such a statement, or that's not possible? Again, I'm number.
Sure. Yeah, sure. No, of course. And so, I mean, the answer, which is almost going to make me gag, is it depends. But realistically, if we're hitting the sweet spot, we're a processing environment that's investing in, new technology that's kind of top of the line, that is sort of pushing the envelope, maybe automation systems, or maybe advanced supply chain and traceability software implementation projects to sort of get better visibility and sort of become more productive. and maybe you've got 20 to 50 employees that are regularly working for you, I would say that in terms of available funding in a year, given depending on your activities, you could probably bank on between $100,000 to $250,000 a year in funding.
That's pretty good.
But that's for the companies that are investing in continuing to innovate, and they've got an R&D budget, they've got things that they're putting out there, they're investing in their employees, they're training them, and they're also looking at small capital as it becomes available or as it's required, and then leveraging funding at the right time. And that's the other key piece here is timing, right? So timing's a big part of the equation.
The thing that I see is companies may have it or may need to massage what they do to have it, but it's not on their radar.
Yeah.
Like I could see that. Like you walk in, I've seen it in my practice. You walk in, by the way, you have this, we do. They might be doing, but it might not be, what I'm saying? It might not be on their radar.
Well, I think entrepreneurs are doing what they do best, right? And so they're driving their businesses forward, whether that's maybe they're a product developer, maybe they are, somebody who's come into a business, maybe it's a generational or a family business, and they're trying to make it their own. I don't think that it's a matter of not wanting to access funding. I think it's just more of a misunderstanding
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
And maybe it pays, like, again, we're not talking selling here. I'm just curious. I'd assume you come in and do some sort of audit.
Mm-hmm.
Like some sort of like...
I hate that word, but sure. Like a review. Yeah.
Let's call it discovery.
Funding discovery. Yeah. It would be kind of the way that it started.
And ask a lot of questions because you put your nose around.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about, let's talk. I'd like you to share your insights into the future. Your insights.
Sure. Okay.
How do you see, whether it happens or not, how do you see this playing out in food and ag based on what you learned over the next year or two? Based on everything that's going on, we all know the problems in food and our food system, sustainability, climate. There's a whole bunch of issues going on. What are your insights? How do you see things playing out? Good or bad?
So I think from a funding perspective, I think we can reflect on some of the key announcements in recent budget to give us some projections for the future. And I'd encourage those who are interested in those really exciting reads to take a peek directly and sort of glean what you can from it yourselves. But the biggest takeaway for me really was the doubling down of the federal government on AI, right? And so artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how that can potentially be applied to different industries through innovative approach. I think, when it comes down to it, one of the major things that we've seen in the last couple of years is that inflation and sort of inflationary cost on food in particular has been, in the news, we'll say. And it's something that is not necessarily going to be changing anytime soon from what we can see, especially with carbon tax and the price to ship food going up. That's going to continue to come down on the consumer. So I think from an AI perspective, any way that we can identify, opportunities to streamline or increase productivity or find efficiencies in general in the supply chain and or in a manufacturing process are going to be potentially rewarded or considered for an incentive from the government. And so if positioned correctly and approached correctly, the application of AI could be widely fundable through a number of different sort of standard, we'll say, government funding programs or sort of regular ones that we've seen year over year, like IRAP, for example. But I really do think that AI is changing the game, not just in food, but in general, when it comes to technology development in Canada. And so the other piece that layers on top of that is the investment opportunities that arise from Canadian innovation and development. And how do we go to market? I think that's going to be another big key challenge that the feds are gearing up to try to support from a commercialization and scale up potential in Canada and for Canadian IP in particular. So that's something else that I think we're going to see some changes on in the next couple of years so that we can try to maintain more Canadian innovations here and benefit from them, for the long term. So like an onshoring effort and sort of more manufacturing happening in Canada.
Good. Thank you for sure. We're almost end the podcast, and I forgot to ask one question. I want to summarize something. and I want to help the audience too. And we talked a little bit about it. Is let's say I qualify for funding, or who wins, who doesn't? Like, is there some tips like you can share, like quick tips, like, hey, best practices, the do's and the don'ts, because ultimately I assume it is a paper flow, it is an application, and and hey, don't make a spelling mistake here. I mean, I'm not saying who it is, right? But any little tidbits that you have, wins and want to get the win, okay? So don't do like a SWOT analysis, the SWOT, like what do you call it? Like a mini SWOT analysis, like,
Sure. So I would say, the biggest piece when it comes to funding is sort of there's a couple things. So the first piece would be just fit. And I always like to say, what's the spirit of the program, right? So what is it that this program was developed to, or what problem or gap or what, let's be honest, advocacy organization lobbied the government to support these categories and why? So that's kind of the first piece, is what is the government trying to do with this funding? And then trying to kind of extrapolate your project, or interpolate maybe your project into that and fit into their box. So it's really key to understand the program and what it is they're trying to achieve. That's kind of the first piece. And beyond eligibility criteria, right? Like, if you check the boxes, great. But there is a difference between competitiveness and qualification, right? So I think in terms of basic eligibility, that's great. But what are, if in an application guide, for example, do they share what is being evaluated in your application? That's a really key part to pay attention to when you are considering applying for funding, is how is this going to be judged? Right. And a lot of these programs have more and more of that information available up front so that you can go through that process and really build a compelling argument. The other thing I would say is, if you don't have a business plan, period. If you don't have a business plan,
like, don't even waste your time.
Right? Like,
don't waste your time.
Get a business plan, or build one. There's lots of tools out there. Like Community Futures has templates. There's, different templates you can access if you're.
They can just call them. They can just call like me, and I'll.
Sure. There's.
I'm not trying to plug myself here, by the way. But that's sometimes you just need some. It doesn't have to be. It could be anybody. There's people out there.
Put it on paper. Build a deck. Have a pitch deck. Have a presentation that you can have ready for whatever it is that you're trying to move forward. Identify your strategic priorities as a company and what your sort of goals are, milestones, and have that so that you're ready to communicate about it. Some of these programs have a 2-week intake deadline. They open, you're lucky enough to find out that the program's open, and then you have to submit within 10 days. That is impossible to do, even with a consultant, if you don't have that backbone or that sort of content.
Here's what they can do. They can get on your mail list.
Yep.
And so how do they get on your, I would assume you have like a newsletter, mail, whatever, you know what I mean?
We're building one out.
How do people get plugged in to your company?
Yeah. So, check us out, asgardconsulting.ca. That'd be the first place that I would say to look. You can also add me on LinkedIn, Sara Hipson. Easy to find, I think, especially through this link that's going to be posted, I'm sure.
I will share that.
The way that I like to do it is have a sort of a funding discovery call. We kind of look under the hood to see what you've got going on. And I can, make some quick recommendations in terms of the path forward. It's not always the case where the programs are already posted or available. So there is some iteration, I would say, in the approach in some cases. Like maybe it's a get this stuff ready for when this program opens kind of conversation. But between grant writing services, advisory, I also offer review engagement, where we basically go through, review a program, and then help you to make sure that you're putting the right content together. That kind of piece is really where I like to play to, because that's empowering your team to do a better job of submitting these proposals. Those are the kind of things that I think I would recommend.
Sara, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We did a little more time than I thought, but that's good. It was great content. But I learned a lot. And there's a word I've been looking for to take out the mystique. I forget the word. It's like almost can be a bit of a maze.
Yeah.
If you're trying to do it. Anyways, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
everybody.
you.
We'll see you next time on the podcast. Take care. Bye-bye.